By 1933, one fact was beyond dispute inside the new German Reich. American jazz was a disease, not a metaphor, not political rhetoric for public consumption. A disease, the specific word used in official Nazi cultural policy to describe what happened when German ears were exposed to the syncopated rhythms, the improvised solos, the African-American musical tradition that had crossed the Atlantic and taken root in the nightclubs and radio stations of Weimar Germany throughout the 1920s. Jazz was what happened when a culture lost its discipline, when racial purity gave way to racial mixing, when the inferior corrupted the superior. The official Nazi position, codified in policy and enforced through law, was that jazz represented everything the Third Reich existed to destroy, and that any German who listened to it was participating in the cultural suicide of his own people. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, makes this position clear from the moment he takes office. The Reich Music Chamber, Reichsmusikkammer, is established in 1933 under his direct authority, with a mandate to regulate every aspect of musical life in Germany. Jazz is the primary target. By 1935, American jazz recordings have been systematically removed from German radio broadcasts. By 1937, a traveling exhibition called Entartete Kunst, degenerate art, tours German cities, displaying artwork deemed culturally unacceptable by Nazi ideology. The following year, on May 24, 1938, in Düsseldorf, its musical equivalent opens. Entartete Musik, degenerate music, applying the same framework to jazz, displaying albums and posters as examples of cultural corruption. The exhibition's poster shows a black musician in a top hat playing a saxophone, a Star of David on his lapel. The visual language of Nazi racial ideology applied to music as explicitly as it had been applied to anything else. Goebbels calls jazz jungle music in public speeches. He calls it an attack on German civilization. He calls it the sound of racial degeneration, dressed up as entertainment. His position is absolute, public, and backed by the full enforcement power of the Nazi state. What Goebbels does in private is a different story entirely, and it is a story that tells you more about the power of American jazz than any amount of praise ever could. To understand what jazz does to Germany during the Second World War, you have to understand what jazz was doing to Germany before the war even started. The 1920s in Germany, the Weimar Republic years, the chaotic, creative, politically unstable decade between the First World War and Hitler's rise, are one of the great jazz moments in European history. American musicians crossing the Atlantic find audiences in Berlin, Hamburg, and Frankfurt who are hungry for exactly what jazz offers: freedom of expression, spontaneity, joy, and the deliberate rejection of the rigid formality that German cultural life had always prized. The nightclubs of Berlin in the late 1920s are playing American jazz every night, and ordinary Germans, not fringe bohemians, not political radicals, but ordinary working and middle-class Germans, are filling those clubs and buying those records in numbers that German record companies find impossible to ignore. This is the cultural landscape that Goebbels inherits when the Nazis come to power in 1933. Jazz isn't a minor imported novelty. It is woven into the fabric of German popular culture at every level. In the radio stations, in the record stores, in the dance halls, in the private homes of millions of Germans who have spent a decade listening to it. Banning it is not like banning a foreign film that most people haven't seen. It is like trying to remove something that has already become part of how people understand entertainment, relaxation, and pleasure. Goebbels understands this, which is why the ban is never quite as absolute as his public rhetoric suggests. The Reich Music Chamber issues guidelines rather than outright prohibitions in many cases. No more than a certain percentage of a program can consist of jazz-influenced music, no more than a certain number of improvised solos, no use of muted brass instruments associated with American swing. The specific band characteristics documented in Nazi cultural policy archives include what the guidelines call hot jazz elements, syncopated rhythms, improvisation, and the use of what the documents call Negro musical influence. German bands are permitted to play dance music, but it must be cleaned up, Aryanized, stripped of the elements that make it jazz. The result is exactly what you would expect when a government tries to legislate musical authenticity out of existence. German audiences listen to the sanitized official version when they have no choice and seek out the real thing whenever they can. Underground jazz scenes develop in German cities throughout the mid-1930s. Private apartments, back rooms of restaurants, venues where the music plays quietly enough that the sound doesn't carry to the street. The swing youth, swing Jugend, emerge as a genuine cultural resistance movement. Young Germans who define themselves specifically by their love of American jazz and their rejection of the official Nazi youth culture that is supposed to replace it. They adopt American clothing styles. They use English slang. They dance the Lindy Hop in private while the Hitler Youth marches past outside. When the Gestapo raids these gatherings, and it does with increasing frequency as the 1930s progress, they find not political conspirators but teenagers listening to Glenn Miller records. Meanwhile, in the private wing of the propaganda ministry, Joseph Goebbels is taking a different view of jazz than his public speeches suggest. His diaries and the accounts of staff members, including his secretary Brunhilde Pomsel, whose testimony was recorded decades after the war, reveal a man whose relationship with jazz was never personal appreciation in any straightforward sense. Goebbels is not a secret jazz fan. He is something more calculated and in many ways more revealing than that. A propagandist who recognizes, with the cold, professional clarity that defines everything he does, that jazz is technically superior to what German cultural policy is producing as a replacement. He doesn't love the music. He recognizes its power. And in the mind of a man who has spent his entire career understanding how to move people emotionally through media, recognizing the power of something and being willing to use it are the same thing. The gap between his public condemnation and his private calculation sets up what happens next. Because war changes everything, including what music does to people and what governments are willing to use to win. Germany goes to war in September 1939 with a population that has spent 6 years being told that American jazz is cultural poison. 6 years of official messaging. 6 years of the Reichsmusikkammer's guidelines. 6 years of the Entartete Musik framework and public denunciations and Gestapo raids on underground swing clubs. By any measure, this should have been enough time to eliminate jazz from German cultural life entirely, to replace it with the approved music of the Third Reich, to leave German soldiers going to war in 1939 with no particular feeling about American swing one way or the other. It hasn't worked, not even close. The German soldiers who march into Poland in September 1939, who sweep through France in May and June of 1940, who pushed deep into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, these men grew up listening to jazz in Weimar, Germany. They were teenagers in the late 1920s and early 1930s, before the bans took full effect, before the Reichsmusikkammer had time to systematically strip American music from every radio and record store in the country. They know what jazz sounds like. They remember what it felt like to hear it. And when the Allied radio stations begin broadcasting it into the territories where German troops are stationed, which happens almost immediately after the war begins, because the Allies understand exactly what they are doing. The men who are supposed to be immune to it are not immune at all. They are hungry for it. After 6 years of official sanitized German dance music, after 6 years of being told that the thing they secretly loved was a disease, after 6 years of suppression, the sound of real American swing coming through a radio speaker in a barracks or a foxhole or a requisitioned French farmhouse is not propaganda. It is relief. The British Broadcasting Corporation begins its wartime jazz programming almost from the first days of the conflict, and the targeting is not accidental. British intelligence, working with American advisors who understand the cultural landscape of occupied Europe, identifies jazz as one of the most effective psychological tools available precisely because of what the Nazis have done to it. By banning jazz, the Nazis have made it dangerous. By making it dangerous, they have made it desirable. And by making it desirable, they have created a situation where any radio station broadcasting American swing to German-occupied territory is not just providing entertainment, it is providing proof that another world exists. A world where music isn't regulated by the government. A world where people play what they feel rather than what they're told. A world that sounds through a radio speaker on a dark night in occupied France or on the Eastern Front, like freedom itself. The numbers that emerge from German military intelligence reports filed throughout the early years of the war are striking. Wehrmacht counterintelligence analysts monitoring radio listening habits among German troops in France find that BBC jazz programming, specifically the programs featuring Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, and other American band leaders, is being listened to by German soldiers in numbers that dwarf what official German radio is pulling in the same time slots. Officers file reports. The reports go up the chain of command. The chain of command sends them to the propaganda ministry. And the propaganda ministry, specifically its minister, finds himself confronting a problem that his own 6 years of anti-jazz policy has made worse rather than better. German soldiers in France in 1940 and 1941 are not just listening to Allied jazz broadcasts. They are seeking them out, adjusting their radio dials specifically to find them. In some documented cases, entire units are listening together, not secretly, not in the kind of furtive private gathering that characterized the swing youth back in Germany, but openly, in groups, in the same way that soldiers everywhere in every war have always gathered around whatever source of music and comfort they can find. The officers who file the reports on this behavior describe it with a bureaucratic neutrality that barely conceals their alarm. The men are not being disloyal. They are not making political statements. They are listening to jazz because they want to listen to jazz, and nothing in 6 years of Nazi cultural policy has succeeded in making them not want to. Goebbels reads these reports, and Goebbels, the cold professional propagandist who has recognized jazz's power without ever loving it, understands what the reports are telling him not as a cultural failure, but as an intelligence insight. The music works, not in the direction he wants it to work, but it works. People listen to it. People seek it out. People choose it over the alternatives. If American jazz broadcast from a BBC transmitter is powerful enough to pull German soldiers away from official German radio programming in the middle of a war, then perhaps jazz, deployed correctly with the right content underneath the music, can be made to work in the opposite direction. This is the logic that produces one of the strangest cultural artifacts of the entire Second World War. In April 1940, by direct order of the propaganda ministry, by Goebbels' own order, a jazz band is assembled in Berlin from Germany's best available swing musicians. The band is given the name Charlie and his orchestra, a deliberately English-sounding name designed to make it sound American to listeners who can't see the musicians. The band's job is to play real American swing music, not the sanitized German version, not the Aryanized dance music that official policy has been promoting for 7 years, but genuine hot jazz, the kind Goebbels has been publicly calling a disease since 1933. They play Glenn Miller arrangements. They play Benny Goodman. They play the exact musical vocabulary that the Reichsmusikkammer has spent years trying to eliminate from German cultural life. And then, between the songs, they insert propaganda lyrics. The technique is precise and documented. Charlie and his orchestra takes American jazz standards, songs that Allied soldiers and British civilians already know and love, and replaces the original lyrics with content designed to undermine Allied morale. A song about romance becomes a song about war weariness. A song about home becomes a song about the futility of fighting for politicians who don't care about the men dying for them. The music is genuine, recognizable, technically accomplished. The message underneath it is poison. The broadcasts go out on shortwave frequencies targeted specifically at British and American listeners. German soldiers stationed in occupied territories who pick up the same frequencies hear something they haven't been supposed to hear in years. Their own government broadcasting real jazz. The contradiction is not lost on them. The music that Goebbels called degenerate in 1933 is now being funded by Goebbels' own ministry in 1940, played by German musicians, broadcast on German transmitters, because Goebbels has been forced by the evidence of his own intelligence reports to acknowledge what he never publicly admitted. The music is more powerful than the ideology trying to suppress it. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the response to German jazz propaganda reveals just how seriously both sides are taking this particular battlefield. The BBC's European Service, working in coordination with American military intelligence after the United States enters the war in December 1941, develops increasingly sophisticated jazz programming specifically designed to counter Charlie and his orchestra. American band leaders are brought in to record special broadcasts. Glenn Miller, before his disappearance over the English Channel on December 15, 1944, records programs for the American Forces Network specifically calibrated to reach German-occupied territory. When Miller goes missing, the announcement comes 9 days later on December 24th, and his band, continuing under the direction of Ray McKinley, keeps performing for Allied troops through the war's end. The music continues. The mission continues. The jazz war doesn't pause for any single loss, however significant. Back in Germany itself, the swing youth movement that Goebbels' Gestapo has been suppressing since the mid-1930s doesn't disappear during the war. It goes underground more deeply, becomes more defiant, takes on dimensions that go beyond musical preference into genuine cultural resistance. Documented Gestapo reports from Hamburg, Berlin, and other major German cities throughout the early 1940s describe repeated raids on underground jazz gatherings, arrests of young Germans caught dancing the Lindy Hop or listening to American records. The sentences handed down become progressively harsher as the war continues. What began as warnings and fines in the late 1930s becomes, by 1942 and 1943, prison sentences, and in some documented cases, transport to concentration camps, specifically for the offense of listening to and performing American jazz. The escalating severity of the punishment is itself evidence of the policy's failure. If jazz had actually been eliminated from German cultural life, if 6 years of official suppression had worked, there would be no need to imprison teenagers for listening to it in 1942. The Gestapo doesn't raid gatherings that don't exist. On the Eastern Front, the situation develops its own specific character. German soldiers fighting in the Soviet Union from June 1941 onward are operating in conditions of almost unimaginable hardship. The distances, the cold, the Soviet resistance, the supply problems, the casualties. By the winter of 1941 and 1942, the certainty of quick victory that characterized the early months of Barbarossa has given way to the grinding reality of a war that shows no sign of ending on German terms. In these conditions, music takes on a significance that goes far beyond entertainment. It is one of the few things that can briefly interrupt the weight of where these men are and what they are doing. German officers in the field file reports documenting the listening habits of their troops with a specificity that suggests real alarm. Men who have access to radios, and radio sets are relatively common among German units by this point in the war, are tuning to Allied frequencies with a frequency that no amount of official discouragement is reducing. The jazz broadcasts they find there have no propaganda content visible to the listener. There are no anti-German messages, no calls to surrender, just music, American music. The same music these men heard in German nightclubs before the war, before the bands, before the Reichsmusikkammer decided they weren't supposed to want it anymore. One documented account from a German signals officer, recorded in post-war testimony and preserved in the German Federal Archives, describes the experience of listening to American jazz on a field radio on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942, with a precision that no amount of official reporting can match. He describes the sound coming through the static as something that felt physically different from everything else about where he was. The cold, the darkness, the distance from home, the war. He doesn't describe it as propaganda. He describes it as the sound of a world that still existed somewhere, a world that the war hadn't reached, a world he wasn't sure he would ever get back to. That is what American jazz does to German soldiers in the Second World War. Not political conversion, not defection, not any of the things that propaganda is supposed to produce, just the unbearable reminder that there is something else, something that sounds like freedom, something that their own government told them was poison, and that their own ears tell them is not. If this story is still working on you right now, if you're still thinking about a German soldier on the Eastern Front spinning a radio dial through static to find Glenn Miller in the middle of a Russian winter, that like button is the right response. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. This channel exists for exactly this kind of story, the ones that fell through the cracks of official history and survived only in diaries and reports and the testimony of people who were there. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The strategic consequences of the Jazz War, because that is what it becomes, a genuine war fought with music as the primary weapon, extend far beyond the immediate morale effects on individual German soldiers. Charlie and his orchestra continues broadcasting until the final weeks of the war, an extraordinary monument to the contradiction at the heart of Nazi cultural policy. The band records approximately 270 titles between 1940 and 1945, all of them documented and preserved in the German Federal Archives. Heard today, They are simultaneously impressive as musical performances. The musicians are genuinely skilled. The arrangements are authentic swing and deeply disturbing as artifacts of propaganda. The same music that Goebbels publicly called degenerate for 7 years is played on these recordings with the technical proficiency of professionals who clearly love what they're playing, layered over lyrics designed to break down the will of the people listening to it. The effectiveness of Charlie and his orchestra as propaganda is difficult to measure precisely, which is the nature of psychological warfare generally, but the continued investment in the project by the propaganda ministry throughout the war is itself evidence that someone in the German chain of command believed it was doing something useful. Goebbels continues funding the band even as Germany's military situation deteriorates through 1943 and 1944, even as the resources available for everything else are being cut, even as the distance between the Germany of 1933 that banned jazz and the Germany of 1944 that funds a jazz propaganda band becomes too large to bridge with any amount of official ideology. On the Allied side, the lessons absorbed from the Jazz War influenced psychological warfare doctrine for decades after 1945. The use of popular music as a tool of cultural influence, not just morale support for your own troops, but genuine penetration of enemy cultural barriers, becomes a standard element of Cold War strategy. Radio Free Europe, which begins broadcasting to Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe in 1950, uses jazz and American popular music as a central part of its programming for exactly the same reason the BBC used it in occupied France in 1941, because the music crosses borders that politics cannot cross, because it communicates something about freedom that no amount of direct messaging can replicate, and because governments that try to ban it make it more powerful rather than less. The swing youth of Germany, the teenagers who spent the late 1930s and early 1940s being arrested by the Gestapo for listening to jazz in private apartments, survive the war and become, in many documented cases, some of the most engaged advocates for German-American cultural reconciliation in the post-war years. The music that their government tried to weaponize against them instead gave them a connection to the world outside Germany that outlasted the war and the government that tried to sever it. Joseph Goebbels dies on May 1, 1945, in Berlin, hours after Hitler's own death, having arranged for his 6 children to be killed before taking his own life. His diaries, the same diaries that document his calculated, cynical recognition of jazz's power, are discovered by Allied forces and eventually published, becoming one of the most extensively studied primary sources of the Nazi era. The entries that deal with music reveal not a secret fan, but a cold professional who understood that the tool he publicly condemned was more effective than anything his own cultural apparatus was producing, and who used it anyway because winning mattered more than consistency. Charlie and his orchestra's approximately 270 recordings survive the war intact and are eventually archived by the German government. They are studied by historians of propaganda, musicologists, and scholars of the Nazi period as some of the most revealing artifacts of the contradiction between Nazi ideology and Nazi practice. The musicians who played on them, professionals who had no particular political loyalty to the regime and were simply doing their jobs under conditions that gave them little choice, are largely forgotten by history, their names buried in archival documents that researchers are still working through decades later. Glenn Miller, whose music was broadcast to German soldiers by the BBC and the American Forces Network throughout the war, disappears over the English Channel on December 15, 1944, on a flight from England to Paris. His aircraft is never found. He is 40 years old. 9 days later, on December 24th, the announcement is made. His band, continuing under Ray McKinley's direction, keeps performing for Allied troops through the war's final months. The music continues long after the man who made it famous is gone, still reaching German soldiers through the static, still sounding like something worth fighting toward. The swing youth, the young Germans who were arrested, imprisoned, and in some documented cases sent to concentration camps for the offense of listening to American jazz, are among the war's least remembered victims, casualties of an ideological battle that most post-war accounts of the conflict reduce to a footnote. Their story is not a story of heroic resistance in the traditional sense. They were not plotting against the government. They were not hiding Jews or sabotaging war production. They were teenagers who liked a kind of music and refused to stop liking it regardless of what the government said about it. In a state where the government regulated what music its citizens were allowed to enjoy, that refusal was sufficient to destroy lives. The music they were listening to, American jazz, the music that Joseph Goebbels called a disease in 1933 and cynically funded in 1940, is still being played today. In concert halls and jazz clubs, and through speakers in apartments across Germany and the world, the music that the Third Reich spent 12 years trying to eliminate continues. The government that tried to ban it lasted 12 years. The music has lasted a century. What German soldiers first heard on Allied radio was not a weapon, in the way that bullets and bombs are weapons. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the sound of a world that existed beyond the war, a world where people made music because they felt like making it, without asking permission, without checking whether the rhythm was Aryan enough or the improvisation sufficiently pure. It was the sound of freedom dressed up as entertainment, and no amount of official policy, no number of Gestapo raids, no propaganda broadcasts from Charlie and his orchestra could make it sound like anything else to the men who heard it. Their own officers couldn't make them stop listening. That tells you everything you need to know about who won the jazz war. We carry these stories carefully, every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. And if this story connects to your own family's history, any country, any side of this war, tell us. These moments belong to everyone. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. The men who listened to jazz through static on a field radio in Russia in the winter of 1942 never imagined anyone would tell their story 80 years later. You just made sure someone did.